Okay, I'm sitting outside today. My daughter's over here riding her horse, and I figured I would make a video while I'm here hanging out with her. And I wanted to go over Article 3 of the Federal Constitution. Before I get started, I want to point out that anything in the Federal Constitution applies only to the people on the federal lands and the federal citizens and the states. So recently, Napolitano had pointed out that something about the waterways and navigable waters, and that I believe what he was saying was that the federal government has the authority to make laws over the navigable waters that are part of the federal lands, part of the federal ports. So there's an old law that says that it's a good judge who expands his property. So expanding your property does not mean that you expand your land, and it does not mean that you expand your jurisdiction, which is power and authority, permanently or over people who you don't have that jurisdiction or control over. So there are people that the federal government, as the United States, have jurisdiction over, which are those people on the federal lands, and some issues between the states, and then everyone else it does not have authority over. So the citizens of the state or the civilians in the state, the federal government does not have authority over them. And so when it's talking about a judge expanding his property, it's talking about the judge expanding his view of equity in order to properly get justice for the people involved in the case. And that's the only reason why they're supposed to expand their property, or in this case, when it's talking about these things, or expanding its jurisdiction. So you may hear politicians say things like it's within their right to expand their property or expand their jurisdiction, or even if they don't say it, they're doing it. But it's not that they're allowed to just take. Governments can't just take or use people. That judges are allowed to do this in order to get justice for the people involved in the case. So one of the things I've heard people say is that the Constitution says that the judges are allowed to interpret the Constitution. So this is not in Article 3. So I believe that the United States, not the United States of America, the United States Constitution gives the United States and Congress assembled power over the federal people on the federal lands, which are used for military purposes. So these various other lands that they have acquired, which are not used specifically for military posts, such as these forests and so on and so forth, are outside of the Constitution. So what does Article 3 say? Okay, the judicial power with a capital P means limited. It's specific and defined of the United States being the government, not United States, not United States Court, not United States Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. Now, some people say that one Supreme Court is a title. It is not. It's in lowercase. One and Supreme is in lowercase. Court is in uppercase. So that means one Supreme Court, which means the Supreme Court. Okay, just like we have the United States, we have the Supreme Court, because it's part of the government. And I'm just looking over here at her riding her horse. She's got an ornery horse. And such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So the inferior courts are mentioned within Article 3, and we're going to point that out so that you can see it in your mind's eye. Okay, and the one eye means focus. That's what the one eye means. The one eye means focus, attention, concentration, to be awake. Okay, that's what the one eye is, to be awake, to be a critical thinker. The judges, capital J, both of the Supreme Court and inferior courts, shall hold their office during good behavior and shall at stated times, times being capitalized mean it's specific times, meaning that it's not constant, they're times that they're appointed. Receive for their services with the capital S, meaning specific services, a compensation, capital C, compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Now, shall is like will. So shall or will not. So they will not be diminished or they shall not be diminished. That is like a direct indication of something that will not be done. Now, it does not say can or may not or cannot be diminished. It says shall, so you will not diminish. Okay, there's a difference between shall and will, and should, may, and can. So when you're reading titles or acts or orders or mandates, you need to look and see, does it say shall, will, should, may, or can? Now, I'd also like to point out to you here that it does not say that judges or justices must be citizens of the United States. It does not say that. It says good behavior. Okay, so 2, the judicial power with a capital P shall extend to, okay, these are their powers, their specific powers. Shall extend to, capital C, cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution and the capital L laws of the United States, federal state. The United States is the federal state for federal purposes or military or defense with a C, because it says C in the Constitution. It spells it with a C, not an S. Those are two different words. Some people will argue that, but you have to go back to the origin of the Anglo-Saxon language called, I can't remember what it's called. I'll tell you later. And treaties made or which shall be made under their A authority. Okay, to all cases affecting ambassadors. Now, these are the civilians. Okay, citizens of the United States are the citizens who are members or in the military. And then you have the civilians who work with the military called ambassadors, public ministers, consuls. Okay, to all cases. Now, there's no period in here until you get to the end of this section. So here we have, this is, I can't really focus, my camera can't focus on it. Section 2, and it ends here, and that's the period. So there's no period in here. Let's see, section 2, the whole paragraph has one period at the end. So everything I'm saying, from the judicial power shall extend to cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority to all cases affecting their civilians working with the military called ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, again, arising within the power of the federal government, because that's all the power it has to give. It can't give power of the states because the states only gave it the power that's in the Constitution. So when it says admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, it's talking about those jurisdictions that were given to the federal government from the states. And those jurisdictions are limited to the federal lands. To controversies to which the United States shall be a party, the federal state. So controversies that the federal state are a party to, these are military things. Okay, now a bracket between a state and citizens of another state. Now you have a state, a free, sovereign, and independent state, and then you have the federal state inside the free, sovereign, and independent state, or the military area inside the free, sovereign, and independent state. So it doesn't define state in here. So what does state mean? Does it mean between two free, sovereign, and independent states? Okay, probably, because you can't have one state having a jurisdiction over another state, because they're always going to see it in their favor. But then we find that true with the federal government also. So when the federal government is hearing a case where it has an interest, it's always going to find that itself is the beneficiary or the winner of the case. It's always going to find in its own favor. And it does. It finds in its own favor. So it's talking about, let's say it's talking about between someone on federal lands and someone off federal lands. Now, again, the Eisenhower Report from 1956 and 1957 calls these federal areas inside the states like islands in the states. Okay, so the federal lands are like islands inside the state, which is a federal state inside a free state. And the federal states are not free because those are military people. They're not free. Okay, between a state and citizens of another state. So when a federal person comes off federal lands and commits a crime, he's committing a crime in the state, in the free state. And so it's saying that the free state has a right to hear the case, but in most states, they agree that the federal government will hear the case and do the punishing since it's a federal citizen. And then after that, they can go to the state and serve any additional time. So if you are a federal person and you commit a crime in the state, you can be tried in a federal court. Okay, between citizens of different states. Okay, so is that the federal state and the independent state or the free state, or both, between different states and the federal state? So citizens of different states. Between citizens of the same state, okay, the same state claiming lands under grants of different states. So it's settling land grants. And between a state or citizens thereof and foreign states, citizens or subjects. Okay, and then they changed these by the 11th Amendment, and I really don't like getting into the amendments, because if the federal government is not running itself according to the Constitution, then the amendments that they pass are unconstitutional. Let's see, the 11th Amendment, 15, 13, 11, passed in 1795. So that's fairly close to when the founders signed the Constitution. Okay, so the next section, the next paragraph has 2 periods, okay? In all cases affecting ambassadors, so a civil servant, or other public ministers and consuls, civil servants, which are civilians working with the military, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. So when it says the state, let's see, it says a state shall be a party. Okay, so when a state is a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. Okay, so when a state has an issue with an ambassador, public minister, or consul, so when a state has an issue with a federal civil servant, ambassadors, ministers, consuls, then the federal government, Supreme Court, has original jurisdiction. In all the other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. So if a federal person on federal lands is in an inferior court because Congress of the United States and Congress assembled, not the United States of America, but the United States and Congress assembled, can regulate the land and naval forces on the federal lands. If they can do that, then they have inferior courts on the federal lands. And so what it's saying is that Supreme Court then has appellate jurisdiction over the inferior courts for the issues of military people who have committed crimes on federal lands or committed crimes in the state and then are tried in a federal court. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state. Oh, I think I forgot to read the rest of it. Okay, so original jurisdiction, period. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction both in law, capital L, and fact, capital F, with such exceptions, E, exceptions, and under such regulations are as the Congress shall make. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crime shall have been committed. Okay, so in that case, if a federal person comes off federal lands and commits a crime in the state has jurisdiction. Okay, so the state shall administer justice to a federal person who commits a crime in a state. I think if you go overseas to like Japan, if a federal person commits a crime off the military post, Japan has ceded jurisdiction of that person back to the federal government, and then he serves his federal time. And then perhaps, because all the contracts with all the different countries and some of the states are just different, then that person, after he serves his federal time, will go to a Japanese prison and serve the rest of his time, if that be the case. Okay, so crimes shall have been committed, but when not committed within any state, that means on the federal lands, the trial shall be at a place or places as the Congress may by law have directed. Those are the inferior courts. So what it's saying, the way I understand it, is that if a federal person comes off, because the federal government only has authority over federal people and such civil servants, that it has like ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls. Those are the civil servants, okay? So it's talking about these federal people who happen to commit crimes either in a state or on federal lands and who has jurisdiction. Now, this was taught when I was in the military. And it's clear to me, to some extent anyway, maybe a little bit more of an extent than the average person, who has jurisdiction. So what it's saying is that if a federal person, a federal employee, either a civil servant or a military member, comes off into the state and commits a crime, the trial shall be in the state. The state has jurisdiction. But if he commits a crime on federal lands, on the island or the military post in the state, the trial shall be in a court, an inferior court, as Congress directs. Okay, that's the inferior courts. Period. There's one period in this paragraph. Section 3, treason against the United States shall consist only on levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. So where is the interpretation? Where is there an interpretation of convicting someone, at least in treason? It has to be on witness or confession in open court. Okay. The Congress shall have the power to declare punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Period. And then it's Article 4. So they're supposed to administer the laws, which means the laws are supposed to be clear. They're not supposed to be left for interpretation. When they're left for interpretation, then they have many ways of existing. They can exist in anybody's mind in any kind of way. So there's no interpretation, there's only an administration. There's an article out there called Statutes with Multiple Personality Disorders. And what this means, what this article is saying, and I've talked about this article before, and I've posted a link to it in the videos where I talk about it, is that the Congress intentionally writes these statutes vague so that they can be interpreted, and they call it proper, but then the courts have to interpret it, which leaves people to wonder if they're actually following the laws or not. And again, these are the people on the federal lands, because the federal laws don't apply off the federal lands. They apply to the states in that the states in their union with each other have some rules to follow and some consistency, but other than what's in the Constitution, they're not linked. And so we are not linked with other states to the extent that the federal government rules over the states completely and all of the citizens. It's really basically all a link or a union with each other for defense purposes, which results in tranquility and general welfare. So the idea that the federal government owns us, owns our land, owns our bodies, and that they can force us to do business with any of its instrumentalities, the Federal Reserve Bank, the FDA, the CDC, and all these other different things these are really just agreements that the states have made with the federal government. But then we get into this whole situation of, what do the states have the authority to agree to without our consent? And what is the legal state? And are we a part of the legal state? And if we are a part of the legal state and we decide we no longer want to be a part of the legal state, how do we get out of that? And you'll see on my video that I posted a little bit ago, a couple days ago, I think, where I had asked one of the legal state employees, how do I remove my land from the legal federal state back into the Republic of Texas? And some people may laugh and say, well, the Republic of Texas doesn't exist because we joined the union, blah, 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 blah. And that's not true either, because it says in the law books that the Republic of Texas still exists. It still retains its statehood. And you can find that in Texas Jurisprudence, 3rd edition, under statehood. And it says there that the Republic of Texas did not give up its sovereignty. That means it still exists. And if it still exists, then I want whatever I own to be in that state, not the legal state created by the federal government as part of its monopoly on business and people, to get us to pay federal taxes and to get us to pay for the public schools and to get us to pay for all these other things, so that when an old person retires and their Social Security is not enough to pay for their property taxes, the Federal Reserve Bank, pretending to be the IRS, pretending to be a government, can come in, swoop down, and take people's property away and resell it to someone who is a willing participant in the legal state under federal control. So it's really a messed up situation that we're in. It's one that they've created where they have all the benefit and control, and we're just subjects to their whims and their misinterpretation or miseducation of what the Constitution is and how much power they actually have. So if you think about them having power only on the islands in the state, which are the federal lands, then everything changes. And you realize that they have no power. And you realize that the Federal Reserve Bank, when it says, well, Congress gives us the power to do all these things, that Congress really can't give them the power to do all these things. Furthermore, many of the acts that they pass are never passed into positive law, which means that they're not actually laws, they're contracts. And under these acts never passed into positive law, or these titles never passed into positive law, that the only way they can get you into a federal court and administer justice or tyranny over you is when you sign a contract. So these acts and these titles that are never actually passed into law and they have no positive law citation, they're just offers to contract with you through their instrumentality. So their instrumentality has to go and have all these forms go through the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, which you can find on reginfo.gov. And you can look through the form approval process and you can see that many of these forms do not comply with the ideas of federalism, which means that they can't be laws, which means that they're offers to contract. And then once you sign it, you agree to it, and then part of the agreement is that the federal courts, the inferior and the superior Supreme Court, gets to administer the justice, even though it's not in the Constitution. Okay, so there you have it. Some information on justice and interpretation. And remember, there's an article out there called something like Statutes with Multiple Personality Disorders. And what that does is it talks about how the Congress writes these laws vague so that they can be interpreted, and they're not actually saying anything, and they can say, well, it complies with the Constitution even if it doesn't. So there is no in the Constitution the right to interpret anything. There's only the right to administer, but they've changed the whole scheme of things by crafting. And they craft by writing everything so vague that it has to be interpreted instead of administered. Okay, so with that, like, share, subscribe, comment, hit the bell notification. Welcome to my channel if you're new here. I'm Jen, the Liberty Lion, and I'll see you in the next video.